What is it like to come face to face with evil? To confront your worst nightmare? When a killer comes calling, there's often no escape.
A man who can kill is evil beyond belief.
To truly encounter evil is a rarity most will never experience.
I believe in evil, and I've experienced people that are evil.
But for those unfortunate few who do, and survive to tell the tale, the mental scars often never heal.
I couldn't breathe, my eyes felt bulging, all I could see was his face on my face, and he was just staring into my eyes.
We meet the men and women whose lives have been forever altered by their brush with the beasts who live among us. This is Encounters with Evil. In tonight's program, we look at sex slayers, murderers whose need to satisfy their depraved and twisted sexual desires plays a major part in their monstrous crimes.
One of the reasons people kill is for sex. It's a motive for quite a few homicides.
A sex slayer is somebody who is motivated by either sexual anger or sexual sadism.
Coming up, Peter Sutcliffe, the infamous Yorkshire Ripper, who terrorized the north of England in the 1970s, claiming God directed him in his evil killing campaign.
He was a man who obviously loathed women, but at the same time was hypnotized, fixated on them.
Stephen Wright, the Suffolk Strangler, who, like Sutcliffe, targeted prostitutes, and in an orgy of violence, slaughtered 5 women in just 6 weeks.
He's capable of killing a wife or a girlfriend. I mean, he even called himself the mean machine.
But first, the killer couple whose name still strikes terror into the heart. Fred and Rosemary West. For more than 15 years, their warped, sadistic sex crimes and ruthless murders went unnoticed in a quiet street in Gloucester.
In the heart of Gloucester, one 3-storey terraced home has become the focal point of the city's biggest ever criminal investigation.
Every floor of this anonymous terraced house held tales of fear, of violence, of murder.
They raped, tortured and killed at least 12 young women in their house of horrors, including 2 of their own daughters.
And the first time I ever heard a West interview, literally, was his vivid and horrifying description of killing Heather and dismembering her body. And this was his own daughter.
Beneath the yellow tarpaulin, forensic teams have unearthed 3 sets of human remains. This is their 6th night excavating underneath a stone patio which covered the garden. 25
Cromwell Street in Gloucester has become a 20th century tale of urban horror.
Fred and Rose West were absolutely the definition of the most deviant sexual sadists and murderers.
The city reeled from shock at the disturbing events unfolding in their midst.
Oh, they're absolutely rocked by it. It has, I think, taken them absolutely aback. It's come as these stories would so suddenly, and the shockwaves are going around the city.
Neighbors could hardly believe they'd been rubbing shoulders with possibly the most depraved and vicious serial-killing couple the UK has ever known.
Tonight, as the media descended on the street, neighbours expressed shock at what had happened on their doorstep.
It's horrible to think that there are, dead bodies in a garden just down the road.
Totally shocking, especially around, in Gloucester. I mean, you wouldn't expect this to happen.
The remains of 9 young girls were eventually disinterred from the cellar and backyard of Cromwell Street.
The suffering that was inflicted on Fred and Rose West's victims was beyond human comprehension. The Wests were instrumental in desecrating their victims morally, physically, through murder. They essentially eradicated the humanness of each and every individual that they attacked.
How a husband and wife could carry out such atrocities like those committed by the Wests is a question still being explored by criminologists.
Well, it's unusual to have two serial killers together. What's interesting and what's worrying in this case is we have both a male and a female killing for sex. Quite clearly, Rose was sexually orientated to kill, and that is extremely unusual.
It's unlikely anyone saw Rose West, or Dozy Rosie as she was known at school, as capable of such horror.
Rose was born in Devon, a timid, rather shy little girl with a very abusive father. Her mother turned a blind eye, though I believe and always have believed that she knew exactly what was going on.
Rose had a hideous childhood. There's no doubt when you look into her history, she was hideously abused. She was systematically raped by her own father, and her whole world would have not been normal in any way, shape or form.
Rose also had the misfortune to meet Fred West when she was just 15 and very impressionable.
I'm always a bit hesitant about using the phrase groomed by her father, but there's no doubt that Rose's dad did not give her a moral compass to help her through her adult years. And no sooner had she fallen into the hands of another man without a moral compass, i.e. Frederick West, she was completely at sea.
Fred's early life was, if possible, even more dysfunctional than Rose's.
Son of a farm labourer who had an appetite for, I'm sure, bestiality with animals, particularly pigs. I believe that Fred was introduced into the family business, if you like. Walter West, his father, I'm sure abused children. I'm sure took advantage of any local girl. After all, they were probably slightly more interesting than the local sheep.
It's widely believed that incest was rife in the West family. And Fred's father's attitude towards sex was deeply unhealthy, and he passed this on to his son.
He had a very disturbed sexual history in the sense that he claims his father said, basically, do what you want and don't get caught, which is hardly the right attitude to set for your son.
Being brought up with such a confused mentality by somebody who's meant to be your role model, particularly for somebody like Fred, you know, he certainly would have been influenced by that kind of messaging.
At 19, Fred slipped up and was convicted of molesting a 13-year-old child, but escaped without a prison sentence, and then moved to Lanarkshire, Scotland.
He finally fell for a Scots woman, Rena Costello, who had been a prostitute in Glasgow. Fred and Rena never got on terribly well. However, they had a child, and then another, Anna-Marie, and then Charmaine. They return to Gloucester. They hire, or shall we say, entice a young woman called Anne McFall to help them look after the children. And Fred, in the end, kills both Rena Costello, his first wife, and Anne McFall, and buries them within sight of the family home in Muchmark.
Fred meets Rose on her 15th birthday in 1968. A year later, they marry, and Rose soon gives birth to their first child, Heather.
You get this union of these two deeply abused and incestuous relationships. But even more frightening, you then get Rosemary West's father and Frederick West abusing Rose, even after Fred and Rose are married, and abusing the children, and finding victims together.
When Rose meets Fred, what we have is a perfect alliance. She's seeking a protective mechanism, but also somebody who can fulfill what potentially she has warped sexual idea-wise. And he has already been engaged in those kind of scenarios himself, growing up an incestuous life with his family. He understands.
I think here we've got a situation where they've both had quite disturbed childhoods with sexual deviancy in the teenagers. I think that just carried on. So they didn't have the moral boundaries that most people would have.
The unholy union of Fred and Rose was cemented by a mutual unhealthy predilection for twisted sex.
Let there be no doubt that West loved sex with young women, often very young women. And he loved to manipulate them and he loved to have his way with them.
West went for a particular type of young girl. They tended to be straying from, for example, the care system, or they might come and work for them because, again, they were quite lost girls, and they're perfect because lost children aren't being followed by anyone, which gives license to that kind of behaviour.
When Fred and Rose moved to Cromwell Road to accommodate their growing family, they took in lodgers, and Rose worked as a prostitute inside their home. Fred would watch through a peephole, sometimes videotaping the sessions. Writer Geoffrey Wansell was granted access to the videotapes for research purposes.
I remember watching Fred's home videos of Rose and the pleasure that she took in abusing herself sexually, in performing for Fred. You cannot take that memory out of your mind.
Clearly it comes across that she's pleasing Fred by her sexual behaviour. He enjoys watching her acting as a prostitute when she was still in her late teens. She engages in sexual assaults on her children, and again, that is for her pleasure, but also for Fred's pleasure.
The couple become, in their sort of narcissistic passion for each other, they begin to slowly lose connection with the moral boundaries around them in their society. There's no reality check for it. And in that sense, it's quite similar to what's called folie à deux, which is shared psychotic disorder, where one person buys into the hallucinations of the other person. In this case, it's not hallucinations they're buying into, it's increasingly taboo behavior.
That taboo behavior was not only depraved sex, but murder. And they hunted down girls for this wicked purpose.
We now know that the girls had fallen prey to the Wests as they cruised the area in a search for victims. Over the next 6 years, the Wests tortured and killed 5 more girls in the cellar of their home.
25 Cromwell Street became a charnel house. Girls were routinely enticed there, sexually abused, tortured, killed, chopped into pieces, and buried in the backyard or cellar.
Nobody looks at a family and suspects that they are capable of the hideous, sadistic murders that took place.
As their depravity continued, the Wests produced 7 children, and their own daughters were not immune from the abuse.
That 2 human beings could work together to desecrate their own family members, let alone strangers. It defies what you think about when you consider human relationships. Husband and wives are meant to be loving and compassionate.
She held down her daughter while Fred, the father, actually raped his own daughter.
In May 1992, Fred West filmed himself raping his daughter, Heather. Heather then made the fatal mistake of telling friends at school.
She starts to tell her friends, and whilst nothing happens, it creates a warning for Fred and Rose. You know, Heather is a loose cannon. Heather signs her death warrant by telling anybody about the abuse.
It's very hard to believe that the Wests literally get away with murder for over 20 years.
Fred was an extraordinary manipulator of people, and that includes everyone, his children, his wife, social services, the police, everyone. But he did it with a sort of charm and a sort of rather insouciance that you might have felt, crikey, well, he's not a bad chap, really, which unfortunately a lot of people, and including at least 12 young women, fell for.
One of the things that the children start talking about is this idea that Heather is buried under the patio, and it's just a standing joke. But a local bobby hears of this, and Detective Constable Hazel Savage is brought in, and she already has some misgivings about the West household and that triggers the investigation.
Hazel Savage, who'd first met West when he was still with Rena Costello, she'd known him a very, very long time, started to say, what's happened to Heather?
It soon became apparent what had happened after Hazel Savage obtains a warrant for Cromwell Street.
A specialist search team arrived at Cromwell Street with a warrant to search for Heather West. They had no idea of what was to follow. Officers who found Heather's remains within hours also found signs that she was not alone.
The Wests are arrested, and after initial denials, Fred crumbles and admits to the murders. Geoffrey Wansell had the opportunity to hear those confessions firsthand.
And I put the tape into the cassette recorder and I pressed the play button, and there is that little sing-song voice. Please give your name for the tape, Fred. Frederick Walter Stephen West. That little Herefordshire burr. Oh, Fred, we'd like to talk to you about Heather. Yes, well, she was very difficult. And then he goes into the most elaborate detail about, well, she'd been very difficult, so I had to hit her. And then, well, actually, I couldn't, I had to cut her up. But getting the legs off is very difficult, and then you have to cut the head off, and then it was extraordinarily horrifying, because this is a man describing killing his own daughter.
As forensic scientists worked to identify the victims, Fred West claimed that he alone was responsible for their deaths.
But Fred was never to face the justice he deserved for his 20-year campaign of murder and sexual depravity.
Prison officers coming off shift said they were shocked, but certainly not embarrassed. Anyone determined to kill themselves could succeed.
On January the 1st, 1995, Fred commits suicide in prison.
In the words of one neighbour, if Frederick West really did kill himself, then it seems almost appropriate that a man accused of taking so many people's lives should end up taking his own.
Rose's trial starts in November 1995.
Her husband may have escaped justice, but Rosemary West must still face the courts. She's charged with 9 murders. All were young women. All were buried under the foundations or in the garden at 25 Cromwell Street. One was her daughter Heather.
Unlike Fred, Rose never confessed to any of the murders.
I went to the trial and I was fascinated by her in the sense that she sat in the dock, absolute straight-faced, looking at the jury, looking at the judge. She gave no emotions at all.
I don't believe that Rose started out as an evil person. I believe that she became wicked because of the effect of her father and the effect of Frederick West. She did many, many evil things, but I don't think she was intrinsically sociopathic.
Were they evil? No, they weren't born evil, but certainly life made them very disturbed people in many ways. They were mentally disturbed in the sense that their values, their boundaries were so out of context with the rest of society.
A verdict has been reached, a jury discharged. But for 8 weeks, audiences around the world have been gripped by the drama unfolding in Winchester's Court Number 3.
Rosemary West is one of only 3 British women to receive a whole life tariff. She will never be released.
Fred and Rose West didn't see their victims as people. They were just sexual objects. They were pleasure givers. They were the vessels that they required.
It's that partnership of evil that is so powerful.
For one member of the abused West family, the verdict offered some kind of closure.
At the end of last week, Fred West's daughter Anne-Marie was given a last chance to look around the building.
I felt that I needed to visit the house for one last time to help me lay it to rest, really. As I was going down the stairs, I could feel, almost taste, the fear.
Our next sexual serial killer went on a frenzied spree of murder in 2006, slaying 5 prostitutes in Ipswich in just 6 short weeks.
From the start of this investigation, detectives said the answers they were looking for would probably be found here in the red light district. That's why they'll continue looking for witnesses here, among the prostitutes, their clients, and others who simply pass through the area.
We're going inside the house of a serial killer. 79 London Road, once just an ordinary semi, now an address on a dark map of dreadful crimes which will never be forgotten. Just the day-to-day debris of a busy home, a cluttered kitchen, a fry-up, possibly his last home-cooked breakfast. Only the grey fingerprint dust left by the forensic team tells you this is a crime scene.
Perhaps the most terrifying thing about the man dubbed the Suffolk Strangler is just how normal he seemed to those who knew him.
We've been on holiday with Steve. We took him back to south of Ireland, Belfast, for some friends and family.
You know, it's a total shock, really, because the thing is, he seemed very, very quiet, unobtrusive.
Nice guy, well, very clean cut, well presented.
He was a man hiding in plain sight. That was how he managed it. He was someone who could convince you, much as Frederick West was, that there was nothing to be afraid of. He was a perfectly ordinary man, in his case, a perfectly ordinary punter for the prostitutes he picked up.
This regular punter was a man called Steve Wright.
Of his 5 victims, he'd known 3 of them and picked them up on a number of occasions.
But hidden beneath the facade of normality Steve Wright maintained lay something very dark indeed.
Stephen Wright was clearly psychopathic. He had this trait, but he kind of made it more affable to others.
There was nothing about him to suggest that he was lurking as a potential killer in any community.
He was, however, very violent with girlfriends, wives.
He went for me with a knife or a pair of scissors, something sharp. It missed me and went in the door, and that's what he was like.
Steve Wright was not just violent at home. He took his anger onto the streets to kill the working girls he knew so well.
We have to think about the mechanics of how he killed the girls. There was very little sign of physical trauma or sexual assault on these girls.
There's no beating about their body, no beating about the head. It would appear that he probably put his hand over their mouths and suffocated them.
A 48-year-old man was arrested at his home address in Ipswich at approximately 5 a.m. this morning. He has been arrested on suspicion of murdering all 5 women: Gemma Adams, Tanya Nicol, Annalea Alderton, Paula Clennell and Annette Nichols.
Could something in Wright's background provide clues to these murderous acts?
You know, we're used to hearing serial killers having very bizarre childhood. He didn't seem to have a very bizarre childhood.
Wright's upbringing was normal and benign to the point of being nondescript.
He left school about 15. He then joined the Merchant Navy. Again, there's nothing unusual in that. He presumably liked travelling, liked to see the world.
It's here he started his lifelong fascination with prostitutes.
As an individual, he was somebody who was completely compulsive and impulsive and addictive in the way that his personality was. So he would gamble huge, he would have sex with lots of prostitutes, he would spend lots of money on things like alcohol.
His compulsive behaviour traits didn't stop him marrying at the age of 20 and having a child.
The marriage didn't last, and besides, by this time, Wright had started what was to become a lifelong addiction to drink, gambling, and prostitutes.
Could have been an individual who had what some experts could say is an addictive personality. So because Wright's life was so bland and dull and there was nothing of interest, nothing of any great magnitude for him to attach himself to, he filled the gaps with his addictions.
After leaving the Merchant Navy, Wright worked as a lorry driver and a publican and had a second child, a daughter.
At the age of 29, he married again, second time, but that lasted less than a year. But at that point, he was running a pub in Norwich.
Second wife, Diane Cole, lived with Wright in the Ferryboat pub. Their marriage was short-lived because Wright's behaviour was so abusive.
He never stayed in. He was out all the time on it, every night. It's all very well people saying, oh, you should have just got away from it. It's not that easy. When you've got a control freak around, you've got nothing for yourself. You're humiliated. It's a terrible situation to be in. I would have said he's capable of killing a wife or a girlfriend in a temper. I mean, he even called himself the mean machine.
The swift unravelling of Wright's murderous spree came with the discovery of the first body of a young woman on the 2nd of December 2006. The body was later identified as Gemma Adams.
That's shocking, you know. She didn't deserve it. It does, that makes me feel sick.
Are you worried that a similar thing could happen to you?
Well, it could happen to anyone.
Paula Clennell went on to be Wright's final victim.
He was comfortable with prostitutes and the working girls were comfortable with him, which is quite important because they didn't see him as a threat because he was well known to them.
Discreetly shielded by a line of police officers in their vehicles, the body of a young woman is recovered from a brook in the countryside just outside Ipswich. For the second time in less than a week, the grim sight of an ambulance taking away a dead girl whose naked body had somehow ended up in a stream.
While reports of discovered bodies mounted, Wright maintained a normal life. In a newspaper interview, his then partner Pamela says they watched news of the girls' bodies being discovered together.
There is this huge myth that you can spot a serial killer, that they look a certain way. But the truth is that they're your neighbours. They're the teacher at your local school. They have a mask of normality, and those masks are so secure and are almost infallible that it takes a great deal for them to slip.
They can compartmentalise their lives so that all of the horror and the evil that happens in the killing doesn't leach out or bleed into their domestic side. They're able to keep this appearance of normality when it's needed. And that's clearly what I think Wright was doing here. He had his domestic life, he had his work life, and he had his killing life, and they didn't leak into each other.
CCTV footage actually captured Wright prowling the red light district in his blue Mondeo. But despite being stopped twice by police for questioning, he aroused no suspicions. The Suffolk Stranglers' campaign of killing prostitutes leaves the red light district of Ipswich almost empty of working girls.
At a time of night when you would expect this main strip to be busy, it seems that the town's working girls have taken heed of the police's warnings and are staying at home. But the fear has spread beyond these streets.
The killing continues until police isolate a sample of DNA.
He was trapped by methodical police work. Officers arrested the 49-year-old when DNA found on the last 3 victims matched a sample taken from Wright following his conviction for theft a few years earlier.
I don't think he expected to get away with it for long. He didn't leave a cooling off period between the kills. He knew that the police were looking for a murderer. He knew that the police were warning working girls. He still took incredible risks.
His speed of killing within a week or so of each one, that is unusual, and all the odds were against him. There was so much police attention, yet he was arrogant enough to carry on doing it, or driven.
Throughout his police interrogation, Wright maintained his silence.
We've got the last girl to go missing with your DNA and the one before with your DNA. Both on their naked bodies. How can that be? You're agreed.
Wright has never, for 1 second, admitted his guilt. He's always insisted, forcefully, that he is an innocent man and falsely convicted.
During his 6-week trial, Wright continued to maintain he knew nothing of the murders.
We've seen this in the case of other serial killers in this country, looking at Dr. Harold Shipman and looking at Levi Balefield, both individuals who refused to play ball. They stonewalled the police.
The easiest thing to do in that circumstance is to deny. It draws the whole scenario out, and you still believe there is just a possibility that whilst the world is watching, you can still walk away.
The jury of 9 women and 3 men reached a unanimous guilty verdict on all 5 murder counts, though those closest to him still seemed unable to believe his guilt.
I've known him for 40 years, and he's not got a malicious bone in his body. I just can't think that he done this.
He left court today knowing an automatic life sentence awaits him. But Steve Wright may still refuse to reveal what drove his murderous campaign.
The most evil thing about Wright is that his devil horns are on the inside, and you just don't know it's evil when you meet it. He was able to persuade those girls to get in his car time and time again.
Although Steve Wright continues to deny all his crimes, he remains in prison and will never be released. Wright's slaying of women who were all prostitutes has drawn comparisons with our final killer, Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper.
The comparison is interesting but not convincing. It isn't utterly clear that, oh yes, Stephen Wright is another version of the Yorkshire Ripper. I don't believe that. Sutcliffe is a very complex, dangerous man with a great deal of deviousness and manipulation. Wright lives in a complete, in my mind, fantasy. Sutcliffe knows perfectly well what he's doing almost all the time.
The Yorkshire Ripper is probably the most prolific serial murderer Britain has seen and will see ever.
Women throughout Yorkshire were terrified to go out at night.
Sutcliffe's warped attitude towards working girls and sex led him to slaughter 13 women in northern England.
The first reports of him being called the Yorkshire Ripper weren't actually to do with specific injuries of the victims, but it was to do with the similarity of Jack the Ripper, targeting prostitutes.
This wasn't just 5 victims in the East End, as Jack the Ripper was. This was many, many victims in a respectable county. You know, we weren't in the alleyways of Whitechapel. We were in the good streets of Yorkshire.
Somewhere near here lives the killer they call the Yorkshire Ripper. His 5-year career of killing began in the red light district of Chapeltown.
The Ripper was mobile. Nobody really knew what he looked like, and there was a real nationwide fear. And every time the news was on, there would be another press conference, and you really had this feeling that out there somewhere was the Ripper, and he was one step ahead of the police.
Detectives suspected one man. Now, 5 years later, the death toll has reached 13, each death bringing grief and tragedy to the victim's family.
And this was before the internet age. This was before texting and social media could fuel a panic. This was generated by TV and newspapers alone.
This is the day Jacqueline Hill would have come home for Christmas with her family. Instead, they wept over her coffin. It's just over a month since she became the 13th victim of the Yorkshire Ripper.
The Ripper seemed to favour working girls.
He had some kind of mission, if you like, against prostitutes, against females in general. He would pick on vulnerable, isolated females.
Some believe there were far more murders than 13.
There is some suggestion that he killed more, but we know he killed at least 13, and then he injured at least another 7.
I have always believed that Sutcliffe killed and attacked long before he started the famous 5-year spree.
What is known for sure is that Sutcliffe's attacks were brutal, vicious, and primitive.
Sutcliffe's weapon of choice was a ball-peen hammer. He would often also have chisels or knives. One of his most common methods that he's used was to get behind his victim at night, in the dark, in an isolated space, and hit them on the back of the head with the hammer.
He would then use a utensil, such as a screwdriver or a knife that's very long. He would disembowel them. He would do various things with their intestines, and some of the injuries that he actually did inflict, ultimately, are not generally reported.
On many of his attacks, Sutcliffe wore a modified pair of overalls. These were overall trousers that he wore, which had the crotch cut out, which meant that he could have sex with a victim at very short notice without having to take off his trousers and his underwear.
What is far less knowable is the motivation of Sutcliffe. How could any human be capable of such sustained barbarism?
Peter Sutcliffe's murders were motivated by his own perverse sense of sex. Peter Sutcliffe was paraphilic. His sexuality had to involve sadism, rape, an initial attraction towards prostitutes, and an obvious idea that they were the less than dead, that they were not going to be noticed, less than a normal person would be noticed if they went missing.
After a 4-year fruitless manhunt, Yorkshire police were still no closer to ending the Ripper's reign of terror. Their focus is drawn to a suspect called Wearside Jack.
If there was one thing that probably delayed Sutcliffe's final arrest, it was the red herring of a tape recording sent to the police by a man who claimed he was the Ripper.
So in their second major bid this week to catch the Ripper, detectives have released samples from one of the 4 letters he's written. Parts of the letters contain details police want kept secret.
The police believed the cassettes and letters were genuine, and they came up with a profile of a Wearside male, looked like this, but the real killer looked like that.
Oh, the hoax was the worst thing that could have happened, because they spent far too much time trying to track down the hoaxer.
The fact that they followed this red herring almost to source to discover that the entire investigation had been diverted to the point where they could have saved quite a number of victims.
I warned you in March that I'd strike again. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George.
We know now that we are definitely looking for a man who originated in the northeast, and have even been able to localise it down to the Sunderland area.
On the occasions that Sutcliffe himself was stopped in the red light district, police officers didn't pay him much attention because he didn't have a Wearside accent, he had a Yorkshire accent, and he was able to go. And while the police were busy looking in that direction, Sutcliffe was over there killing more and more victims.
The police came in for a lot of criticism during the Ripper manhunt, not least because they actually interviewed Sutcliffe on a number of occasions. But in the pre-computer age, they were simply overwhelmed.
They didn't have the technology, they didn't have the initial resources and manpower that they needed.
You cannot possibly cross-reference everything physically and mentally. It has to be done by computers.
He came up 9 times, and the police got criticised for that, but they were interviewing thousands and thousands of suspects.
They were also under intense pressure from the local authority, from Parliament, to solve this, to find the Ripper. You can't just let this go on.
Clearly lessons were learned. The Home Office knew that they needed to bring in a computerised system to manage the flow of this information.
The terror across Yorkshire was intense. Many women stayed home after dark, though there were plenty who had no choice but to venture out.
The murder victim was identified tonight as 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill, a student who had been living in the Headingley area of the city. Miss Hill's body was found on waste ground near a shopping centre late this morning. There has therefore been inevitable speculation that she may be the 13th victim of the Yorkshire Ripper.
And still detectives were no nearer to identifying the Ripper. Even those closest to Sutcliffe had no idea.
People at work thought he was chatty, thought he was Jack the Lad. He wasn't seen as being an abnormal loner. He wasn't seen as being a weirdo or someone strange. Nobody suspected him.
He was a very accomplished liar, a very accomplished manipulator of the police, and a very accomplished manipulator of women, including, I suspect, his wife Sonia.
It's perfectly reasonable to believe that Sutcliffe had no idea what her husband was doing, because he had a job where he moved around a lot, where he was driving around a lot, and there was no mobile phone for him to keep in touch.
Finally, after thousands of police hours spent on one of the biggest manhunts ever seen, after the years of fear, of dead ends, of hoaxes, Peter Sutcliffe was apprehended in the most mundane circumstance.
The police only caught him by chance. He was in a car with fake number plates.
They phoned the control room says, yes, the car's stolen. They realise that false number plates have been put on it.
And he had a working girl with him in the car. They got him out for a chat, and Sutcliffe said, I need to go and take a leak. And he went over to take a wee behind a bin, and while he was there, he ditched his hammer and a chisel. And it was only because that police officer afterwards thought, I let him out of my sight for 2 minutes. And the police officer went back behind the bin and found the stuff Sutcliffe had dumped.
Sutcliffe was subsequently taken to the West Yorkshire Police headquarters. After 2 days of intense questioning, he suddenly declared he was the Ripper.
There was no way he could deny the crimes. He would be tied to them forensically very easily.
I think he'd got to the point when he knew, one way or another, even subliminally, that he was very unlikely to get away with it again, and let's deal with it now. And so he rapidly, and I do mean very rapidly, within about 24 hours, starts what became the most extraordinary series of confessions to 13 murders and 7 attempted murders of women. Almost chapter and verse.
He admitted his guilt, of course, with diminished responsibility, and that's where the element of psychiatry and the law would clash. How much of Sutcliffe was responsible for what he did and how much was not responsible.
Several weeks after confessing to the murders, Sutcliffe claimed that he heard the voice of God telling him to rid the world of harlots.
Sutcliffe said today that his mission to kill began here, Bingley Cemetery, where as a teenager he worked as a gravedigger. It was something I felt was wonderful. I believed then and now that it was the voice of God. I was standing in an open grave, taking a rest from digging. I heard a voice similar to a human voice, but with the words mixed up. In the years to come, Sutcliffe claims to have received hundreds of messages urging him to continue killing.
One of the things that you would have is, in schizophrenia, you would expect to have hallucinations and command hallucinations, some voice in your head telling you to go and do something.
His claim to have slaughtered women for God at his trial raised a huge question mark about his sanity.
He suddenly started to argue that, oh, far from being a bad person, he was a mad person. He was a paranoid schizophrenic, and that he couldn't possibly be tried as a sane man because he was completely mad.
The jury of 6 men and 6 women took their places. They heard the Attorney General, Sir Michael Havers, say they had one decision to make. Was Peter Sutcliffe a schizophrenic, or is he a cunning, sadistic killer who's invented his madness in the hope of winning a lighter sentence?
I agree with their definition that he was paranoid schizophrenic. I've been fortunate enough to talk to 3 out of the 4 psychiatrists that interviewed him, and they all 4 of them agreed that he was a paranoid schizophrenic.
We do need to remember that psychiatry is not an exact science. There's an element of subjective opinion in diagnoses. He clearly wasn't normal, wasn't healthy, but back in the 70s, paranoid schizophrenia was a go-to diagnosis. A modern-day Sutcliffe would be diagnosed as having some kind of psychopathic personality disorder.
The problem is, says the Attorney General, that none of this was told by Sutcliffe to the police in a very lengthy interview he gave them. He simply said, I have these urges to kill.
This could be believed, this could be dismissed. Unfortunately, many killers go for this kind of defense, the idea that for every kind of crooked act, there is a crooked molecule within my brain, so it is not my fault.
Finally, the jury decide.
So Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, is a mass murderer. The jury of 6 men and 6 women took nearly 6 hours to reach their verdict. As each of the 13 women's names was read out, the answer was the same, by a majority of 10-2, guilty of murder on all charges. Outside, the crowds who'd waited so long for a verdict were delighted. They unashamedly rejoiced at the news that Sutcliffe was to spend at least 30 years behind bars. But for West Yorkshire Police, it's the end of a nightmare which began 5 years ago.
Even in jail, Sutcliffe continued with his claims of insanity.
But the ever-devious, manipulative Sutcliffe was never going to give up. So he convinces, first of all, the prison authorities and then a number of distinguished psychiatrists that he is indeed a paranoid schizophrenic and he shouldn't be in an ordinary prison, but he should indeed have special treatment in Broadmoor Special Hospital, which he duly gets.
After over 30 years of life in a secure hospital, psychiatrists determined that Sutcliffe is now mentally fit to be returned to prison. And on the 24th of August 2016, he was transferred to HMP Frankland in Durham.
The decision to declare Sutcliffe mentally well enough to leave this high-security hospital needs to be rubber-stamped by the Justice Secretary.
Sutcliffe is one of the most depraved, dangerous, devilishly evil men. He is simply disgraceful.
I hope we never see another killer of his ilk terrorise the nation, but the legacy, I think, lives on much longer than any other serial murderer we've seen.